This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the WeAct Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and it's been quite a week. One nation under a lockdown in Ferguson. We'll be covering that with a special on-the-ground report from producer Pete Ferguson. In Ferguson from producer Pete Callahan in the third hour. We will also be talking about some of the economic challenges we face, the role of private equity dominating the business lives and working lives of millions of Americans, another secret trade deal you don't know about. But in this hour, we're going to focus on Social Security, because one thing that has escaped a lot of people's attention but is very, very important is that this week, August 14th, Thursday, was Social Security's birthday. And you know, as the birthday was coming up, I kept having this nightmare. Okay, it starts out nicely. 300 million Americans around the country are happy. They're wishing Social Security a happy birthday. They're singing its praises. They're celebrating. Then a big giant cake is rolled out while everyone sings the happy birthday song, and out pops Senator Alan Simpson, looking like Freddy Krueger and swinging a buzzsaw that has the words "Change CPI" painted on it in red. Now, Alan Simpson, in case you've forgotten, is the remarkably uninformed former Republican senator from Wyoming who has made a post-political career out of taunting, mocking, and trying to take benefits away from seniors in need. But look, he's not the only chainsaw swinger in Washington who might haunt your Social Security nightmares. So could any one of the politicians, policy analysts, and so-called think tank employees who have targeted the program, usually because they're on the payroll of someone like hedge fund billionaire Pete Peterson or some other Wall Street banker. Which got me to wondering, could you fit the entire staff of the Third Way think tank inside a 6-foot layer cake? Be interesting to try. And so, okay, maybe I don't really have nightmares like that, but August 14th was Social Security's birthday, which raised a very important question. What do you give the program that has everything? After all, Social Security has massive public support. It's the most efficient program of its kind in the country, beating the private sector by a mile with administrative costs of less than 1%. And despite what all the fearmongers keep saying, its long-term financial prospects are better than those of most government programs. I mean, think about it for a second. Can you name any other government initiative which doesn't add to the deficit, is fully funded for the next 2 decades, and could survive way beyond that, maybe for a century, with minor and easily achievable fixes? I can't. A few years ago, I would have said that the best birthday present you could give Social Security was a few more tough defenders. Back then, President Obama's Deficit Commission, which, by the way, was co-chaired by Alan Simpson, was a toast of Washington, and everybody loved its crazy plan to gut Social Security. People even thought it was wise. They had it all wrong. You may remember Martha Raddatz from ABC, hosting and acting as moderator for the vice presidential debate when she said this, and I quote, "Both Medicare and Social Security are going broke and taking a larger share of the budget in the process." That's a twofer. She shoehorned 2 complete misconceptions into a single sentence. Neither one of those statements are true. And then President Obama, maybe you remember in another debate when he said this, quote, "I suspect that on Social Security, we," meaning he and Mitt Romney, "have got a somewhat similar position." Sadly, they did, but things are starting to change. Social Security has more defenders than it did a few years ago, and their ranks are growing every day. They're shifting the debate away from benefit cuts and toward an expansion of the program instead. In fact, a number of bills to expand Social Security have been introduced in the 113th Congress, from Bernie Sanders and Representative Pete DeFazio, from Senator Harkin and Representative Linda Sanchez, from Senator Mark Begich and Representative Theodore Deutsch, and from Representative Glenn Moore. Senator Elizabeth Warren recently became a great advocate for Social Security expansion. And down in Hawaii, while they're still counting the ballots as of now, Brian Schatz has really come from behind and may take it, partly because he co-sponsored Senator Harkin's bill and spoke up for Social Security. So what we're seeing is that even in red states like Alaska or Louisiana, where Senator Mary Landrieu is fighting for Social Security, people are realizing that this is a winning issue. So what are we going to do about it going forward? It's smart policy because wage stagnation, wealth inequality, and cutbacks to private industry retirement plans have led to a retirement crisis in this country. The best way to address it is by expanding Social Security benefits. And studies show it's possible to address Social Security's long-term needs and expand its benefits through a blend of options that are readily available to us. It's also, and we have to make this clear to our elected officials, smart politics. The polls show that Social Security enjoys enormous support across party and ideological lines. Most Americans would happily pay a few more dollars each week in payroll taxes in return for an increase in benefits. So everybody out there in the political world, here's a warning. Social Security will be a critical campaign theme in 2014 and in 2016 too. It's an issue with staying power for one simple reason. Everybody hopes to retire someday. Most people realize they could become disabled at any time. And the Social Security issue resonates with broader populist themes of economic equity. And those are themes that ignite voter enthusiasm. Social Security is important to people and has already received a great birthday present. Its advocates don't have to play defense anymore. Its champions aren't just beating back bad ideas like the chain CPI benefit cuts or dispelling lies about its financial prospects. Today, they're also articulating a vision for rebuilding the nation's broken retirement economy using Social Security. Now, the battle isn't over. The cutting crew is still well-funded. Its backers are very determined. But this year, there's even more to celebrate about Social Security. So if you want to have a party, go ahead. Just don't ask a banker to provide the cake. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and joining us now is Eric Kingson, who is co-director of Social Security Works. He is a professor of social work at Syracuse University's School of Social Work, senior research associate in the Maxwell School's Center for Policy Research. He has been an expert in this issue for a long time. He was a policy advisor to the 1982-83 National Commission on Social Security Reform and the 1994 Bipartisan Commission on Entitlement and Tax Reform. He is also the primary author of Ties That Bind, The Interdependence of Generations, Social Security and Medicare, a policy primer, author of The Diversity of the Baby Boom, and co-editor of Social Security in the 21st Century, and wrote Lessons from Joan, Living and Loving with Cancer, A Husband's Story, which is a beautiful book, and In Their Own Voices. Eric, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Richard. RJ, it's great to hear your voice.
Yours too, and feel free to call me Richard. I go by both. I introduce myself by both names. The RJ thing was actually just to distract people when I still had corporate clients when I began writing again, so that they wouldn't realize it was the same guy, and then ban me from their, from working for them forever. But that's another story. So listen, this week was the August 14th, 79th birthday of Social Security, and I know you and Nancy Altman wrote a piece about this, but what should people be keeping in mind as we approach the 80th year of this program?
That we have a system that works. It works because we've made a strong investment in building something to protect ourselves against lost wages and retirement, disability, and death of a parent. We have a system that works and works well, that it's withstood wars and recessions and depressions, and there's every reason to think it will work well into the future. But most importantly, it's now time to talk about how to expand the system. And that is because we face a major set of crises. Retirement income crisis. The American working people face this, where well more than half will be unable to maintain their standards of living in retirement. That's people in their 50s, 40s, early 60s, 30s, and 20s. We have a job to do, and we have a job to do with Social Security also to support our families when our members have to take leave to care for children or care for themselves or care for an ill relative or friend. So there's an agenda. There's a capacity to move forward, and by gosh, our country can afford it.
You know, one of the things you mentioned a couple important things there. One of them that came to mind as you were saying that was this relationship among generations. You know, the book you were principal author, the Ties That Bind, the Interdependence of Generations. The idea that, first of all, if you look at it from an actuarial or economic fiscal point of view, the differences in contribute. You know, people are sometimes opponents of Social Security, or those who would cut it, sometimes harp on intergenerational wealth transfer as a theme, and they use all sorts of misleading figures. When you strip those out, it's really trivial. But what's underlying all of this is the sense that, first of all, in my but to tell me what you think. First of all, that they complain about baby boomers, but then turn around and propose policies that would hurt younger people. And secondly, that they forget that we are in this together, which was one of the things I think implied by what you were saying. So how do we remind people that that we're in this together?
I think that's critical, Richard. Bottom line is nobody gets anywhere in life without help from others in some way or another. Not the most successful, rigid individualist or anyone else. Everyone benefits from those who came before them, parents who hopefully reared them, if not parents, teachers, roads we drive on, roads that companies use to send commerce forward. And same, and Social Security is a core part of that. This is a structure that enables us to do things together, do things for ourselves that we can't do by ourselves, that we must do together. The creation of a fake intergenerational crisis, which has been used repeatedly to argue that Social Security isn't going to be there, it's unfair. These are the same people who want to shred the Social Security program for younger generations. They talk out of both sides of their mouth. On the one hand, they say it's unsustainable. We have to protect it for our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. You look at what they're doing, and they're leaving their children and great-grandchildren and others with a system that is deeply flawed, deeply weakened, and would pay far less in benefits to Americans than what we have today, even if Congress does nothing. One thing that's often forgotten, and I'm not going to harp on this. They like to talk about Social Security is going broke. It's going belly up. Well, that's ridiculous. Even though people believe that because they've heard it over and over again by groups that want to change the system to their benefit, perhaps some Wall Street interested groups, financial managers, and ideologues who just don't like this system. But the reality is, as long as Americans are working in the future, then it has an ongoing stream of income that easily meets 3/4 of the projected benefits people have earned. There's a lot more we can do. But the other reality is, as long as Americans have families and a sense for each other, as you're pointing out, there are linkages across generations, and there are benefits for everyone for having a good Social Security system. My children don't have to worry about my retirement because I have Social Security. Other things, too. I'm fortunate. But my children are freed up to focus on some of their needs. Our young children are protected with Social Security life insurance. Most Americans don't know this, but it's the single most important life insurance most Americans have for their children, worth almost $600,000 for a family with a couple of young kids. So we are all in it together, to just go back to that. And nobody gets ahead without others helping them. We help each other in families, from diapering our children to disciplining them, to raising them, to helping them go forward as adults. We help in all sorts of ways, and we do some of that privately, and some of it we do through government.
And I can't help but thinking as we talk about this that it's not just the intergenerational relationship, but there once was a time when successful people in this country, financially successful people, were grateful for that and appreciated and understood what their country had done for them. I always think of Colonel Tom Parker, who was Elvis Presley's manager, who said, it said at one point, I consider it my patriotic duty to keep Elvis in the 92% tax bracket because the highest tax rate was 92% back then, and that was understood and accepted under a Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower. And now we have a situation where, as Thomas Piketty and others have shown us, the inherited wealth is getting massive and distorting the economy for everyone. And more often than not, and by the way, Alan Simpson is a child of privilege and prosperity, among others. It seems that everyone who is leading the charge and funding the charge to dismantle Social Security is doing quite well for themselves, whether it's the Wall Streeters who fund the Third Way Group, or whether it's the Pete Peterson, the hedge fund billionaire who funds so many of these efforts and has employed Simpson and others in so many different situations, or the spokespeople like Simpson. And so it seems to me that, and I'm curious your thoughts about this, and then we'll take a break, but it seems to me that this is also another form of class warfare being waged on 99% of the population by the extraordinarily wealthy. You think that's a fair conclusion?
I think it's a very fair conclusion. I laugh. They talk about protecting these programs for their children, grandchildren. Well, that's really what it's about. It's protecting them for the children of the very well off. Not that it's what they propose would cut the system dramatically for everyone else. I think you're right when you say something's been lost. President Eisenhower, our moderate Republican president, he used to look at people like Pete Peterson and look at the people like the Koch brothers, and he had this wonderful quote which says, there are a few people who would pull apart Social Security, Medicare, farm subsidies, and the like. They are small and they are few. Of course, there are folks like H.L. Hunt, the oil man. That's sort of the equivalent of our Koch brothers today. They are few and they are stupid. That's our plain, wonderful quote. You haven't heard that one, huh?
No, I love it.
It's even better when I'm not paraphrasing it, but it's really quite remarkable. It's in a letter to his brother Edgar Eisenhower.
That's wonderful.
Look, Eisenhower was an interesting man. He believed in institutions. He was not a civil rights person. He grew up with a belief in segregation, but the law of the land was that the schools were going to be integrated, and by God, he brought the troops in to integrate and enforce the Supreme Court decision of 1954. So it's different from what we have today. We have people today who want to tear apart anything, on the right. They'll tear apart anything they don't believe in. The Koch brothers' father was involved back then as a John Bircher. So we have,
And Eric, I want to continue. I actually love where this conversation is going, and I want to talk about this a little bit more about the evolution of the right. But we do need to take a break. Sure. So what I'm going to suggest is that we go to break now, and then when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about the right-wingers of Eisenhower's day and the right-wingers of today and how they managed to get a free pass for what we once understood was outrageous and antisocial behavior. But we're talking with Eric Kingson, co-director of Social Security Works. I'm Richard RJ Eskow. We'll be right back after this. This is The Zero Hour. Back on the Zero Hour with Eric Kingson joining us, co-director of Social Security Works, on the occasion this week of Social Security's 79th birthday. And Eric, before we went to break, we were getting into an interesting conversation about right-wingers then and now. And back in Eisenhower's day, when Dwight D. Eisenhower represented the responsible Republican view of things. He was by no means liberal, but he, for example, the 1956 Republican Party platform boasted about the fact that more workers were unionized, boasted about the fact that more people were now covered by Social Security than ever before. So he was, there was common understanding of what it meant to be a society, what it meant to be a nation, what we owed one another, and there might be differences, policy differences within that. But, you had that common sense. And back then, we started talking about conservatives then, and now you mentioned the father of the Koch brothers, who was a Bircher. You also mentioned H.L. Hunt, and I remember that back in the early 60s, when I was probably like 12 or something, I picked up, so maybe mid-60s, I picked up a copy of his book, Alpaca, I think it was called. It was a combination of autobiography and sort of utopian fantasy, as I recall, but from his point of view. And I ought to go back and reread that, because I remember he had crazy ideas like only rich people should vote, and they should vote in proportion to, how much money they had. People just, he's a nut. But now you have Tom Perkins, the internet billionaire, and a lot of these other internet types saying the same things. You have that kind of radical libertarian view. Has there been a breakdown in the sense of what it means to be a community here?
I think so, but even more so, we have that frame being implemented with Citizens United and with the unlimited spending available, the secreted unlimited spending available to push an issue to the advantage of a candidate you support. But we've had a breakdown in campaign contributions. So effectively, they have been buying, they have the money to buy elections, and they're using it. Not that Democrats don't use money too, but these folks have been using very targeted, extremely large dollars. Everyone has a right to their opinion. That's what our country is about. But no one should have the right to control the political process with a huge amount of money, or no one should have the right or should be trying to take away the vote from Americans. That's also a strong part of the mainstream right-wing agenda of the Republican Party. It's scary. It's very scary. We fought for voter rights in the 60s. The country changed, and it has changed, but we're taking these huge steps backwards on voting. So there's a lack of civility. There is a lack of sense of connection with each other. And one of the things that does connect us, and here, let me take an optimistic turn here. As you know, Richard, I've spent 5 years working with my colleague and friend Nancy Altman, with Alex Lawson, with many other pretty wonderful people to help fight first cutting Social Security, and now spend some time through Social Security Works and all the other groups, Alliance for Retired Americans, to send the message that it needs to be expanded. When we started this last round, the idea of cutting it, the storyline was, how much do we cut? A whole lot? Do we privatize some of it? Do we cut it a lot? Or just what they would call tweaks. Tweaks were actually quite a lot. They really hurt people a lot. Now, as the American people's voice have gotten into this discussion, a lot of groups have done hard work to do that, to get Americans talking about it. We are now seeing members of Congress being increasingly reticent on the Republican and Democratic side to talk about cutting the cost of living adjustment or anything. And we're starting to see large numbers of Democrats, hopefully one day Republicans too, starting to talk about the need to expand protections, the need for things like paid family leave if you're taking care of a sick child or a disabled family member, or if you're sick. Senator Gillibrand has a proposal in there. It's not going to happen this week, but it is a core protection that nearly every other nation has, every other industrial nation. So these ideas are out there, and they're becoming acceptable. We're hearing large numbers of people in the House and Senate start talking about expanding benefits, and we're starting to see moderate members of the Senate, like Senator Begich, sponsoring expansion bills. So the thing that I think, in one sense, these modern-day right-wing and billionaires, they're pumping a lot of money into the economy, for some really bad ideas, but they're probably helping our economies because they're putting a lot of money in. But the thing to be said about it is they're not gaining traction in the way that they had expected. They're frustrated, and the reason they're frustrated is outside of Washington, the American public gets it. You just can't sell the idea to Americans that they're doing very fine in retirement. Now, as Americans become aware of the retirement income crisis, some of the more conservative intellectuals on the right are saying, well, things aren't as bad as they seem. Actually, Americans have a lot of money in retirement savings. Well, people just have to look at their bank accounts. So I think we're on a positive edge there, and it's because Americans, and these are Americans of all political views, Americans are getting into this discussion. And so in that sense, it's positive. But the stranglehold that some of these very well-off oligarchs have on our politics is frightening. And the most frightening, or a frightening thing, we are a rich nation. Unfortunately, for the last 30 years, 2/3 of the growth of income went to the top 1%. Before
this is something, you're absolutely right. And I think it's very important for us to remind ourselves that this seems to be one of the things they don't want to talk about anymore is we are a rich nation. It's just that all the wealth is, as you say, going to a very few people. But they'd rather have us believe that we've reached now the era of limits, as it was once called.
Right. Well, Richard, you're promoting class conflict here, aren't you?
Right.
So
exactly.
am I. That's the argument. This isn't a polite thing to talk about, but there's nothing polite about a family who doesn't have enough money to buy the kind of food they need for their children. That's not polite, but that's called people who just don't deserve it. These are folks, and not all of them. I mean, not every person who has a lot of money is a bad person or, whatever. But we are looking at where from 1949 to 1979, 2/3 of the growth of our income, when our economy was expanding very well, 2/3 of it went to the bottom 90%. Today, we saw all of that 2/3 go to the top 1% for the last 30 years. And in fact, everything went to the top 10%. The bottoms actually, on average, lost something. So,
and when we mention that, and they say it's class warfare, it's like the guy who steals your wallet, and when you ask for it back, he says, "Why is it always money with you?"
Yeah, it's the same. Yeah, no, it's really, and I think that's where that dialogue needs to be out there. The dialogue about taxes. Our tax policy has become a huge giveaway, mainly for the very well-off. All of us would prefer to pay less taxes, but we would also like to live in a society that has roads and decent medical research and variety of things, capacity to protect us if it's needed. That's the as they say, the price of civilization. Well, they managed to avoid it well. And so I think, to put it back to Social Security, there's not only nothing wrong, there's everything right with asking millionaires and billionaires to pay the same Social Security contribution rates as their secretaries pay. After earning $117,000, we contribute nothing in the course of a year. There's every reason to gradually get rid of that artifact. That in itself would address 4/5 of this projected shortfall we have in the system. And then on top of that, you mentioned the 92% marginal tax rate. Right now, I think it's about 38 or 39% on the very well off. There's no reason not to have a 10% additional tax directed at Social Security on the millionth dollar you receive in a year. You're not going to go broke paying 10% on everything in excess of $1 million. That would allow for a very large expansion. Similarly, we could all contribute a little bit more through our payroll taxes, very slowly by putting in maybe 1/20th of a percent increase a year over 20 years or 10 years. There are many ways to adjust the system. The key thing is we have to understand it's what we want as a people. I guess a point I would make, and you've probably heard me make this, is too much of the discussion about Social Security is about dollars and cents, as I just did. Too much is about that without looking at the impact on human beings, on the American people, and without understanding that financing, as important as it is only a means to an end. The end is to provide broad protection and enable Americans to protect themselves against risk we all face as working people. And the other end there is also to have a civilized society. We believe Social Security puts a set of values into action. The injunction to care for our parents, to care for children, to care for our neighbor. Also the expectation, you work hard, but if you work hard, you get something back in return. All of this is important, along with core support for the idea of human dignity. And these are old-fashioned and very good values. And that, I worry when we have our discussions on Social Security that we move sometimes so far afield from its purpose and we get bogged down in the details. But the core purpose is to enable the American people to do something for themselves that they can't do by themselves.
Well, and I think that is a great way to put it, and I think we're coming to the end point. I think it's the ideal way to end it by saying that this is really, and one of the things that's drawn me to this fight for Social Security as well, that this is not just a fight for an outcome, it's a fight to restore some fundamental values, a fundamental definition of decency on the community and national level about who we are as a people, what our values are. And I think I've gotten a lot of that from you, and I thank you for that. And I thank you for coming on the program. Eric Kingson, Professor of Social Work at Syracuse and co-director of Social Security Works. As always, it's wonderful to talk with you.
And Richard, with you, and thank you for being such a wonderful voice on Social Security and many other things.
Well, I appreciate that. And with that, we will go to break. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and to round out our Social Security segment, joining us now is Julian Blair, from my home turf in Maryland, where my daughter still lives, I think, in Silver Spring. He is a retired Vietnam War veteran. Julian is also a recipient of Medicare and VA disability benefits, and I say, why the hell not? He earned them. He's a father of 4 with 2 grandchildren, and I would describe, from what I know of Julian through his biography, I would describe him as an American success story in both senses of the word. He earned his bachelor's degree through the GI Bill and was able to purchase a home using a VA loan. That's an American success story, both for what he did to improve himself and for society's recognition of a role that improving oneself is a collaborative process. He then worked for 15 years before retiring and is now a full-time volunteer and activist. Julian, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for the good work you do. Now, you're working with an organization right now called Spaces, I believe it is, based out of Washington and Silver Spring. And tell us a little bit about what you're doing there.
Okay, what I do, I work on what we call our retirement security program. And that is ensuring that the Social Security Act as it is now is protected. But we would also like to see that expanded. There are some programs that we have in place that where we go out, we educate the public. We just want them to know what's going on, how they can get engaged in helping us do this. And the second thing is that we also engage our elected officials. We let them know that their constituents want them to support the efforts that we are doing. We also have cards that we sign, that we have our constituents sign, and we take them to the representatives and just let them know that, this is important to a lot of Americans because retirement security is just important. And because they have a right to have retirement with some dignity.
Absolutely. And so I guess you're out there talking to people a lot when you're doing this kind of communication work, constituent work. I guess you talk to folks a lot about how they feel about Social Security, how they feel about Medicare and security and retirement, right?
I'm sorry.
Do you get a lot of people saying, no, I'm getting too much out of this and I don't ought to give it back? Or do you hear people basically saying, listen, I depend on these programs?
Well, I've never heard anyone say they get too much and they would like to have it. Never. Most people,
I didn't think so.
No, most people say that they've earned their Social Security. No one gave it to them. They worked very hard for it. They paid into it, and they deserve it. And they, a lot of people are nervous that because there's a lot of talk here about raising the retirement age, cutting Medicare benefits, cutting the benefits that people receive monthly. And so there's a lot of fear versus joy as the terms I use. I mean, it's just not much joy. Everybody's happy that they're getting a check, but they're worried also.
Right. And of course, they've been hearing political talk about exactly what you said, cutting the program, cutting back and that sort of thing. And it leaves people with, it seems to me as if people have been trying to get people afraid about these programs as part of the effort to cut them. But what do you do? What do you tell people when they tell you that they're fearful about the future?
Well, I tell them, I say you're going to hear a lot of things. The main thing you have to do is make sure that you educate yourself on what's going on. And that part of it is. What we do, we go out and educate people, but we also let them know that they can go to they can Google information about Social Security. They can talk to the Social Security Department, and they can just look at and just separate myths from fact. And they do that by just being involved. I mean, I'm not talking about they don't have to get in the streets and march every day and do these type of things, but being involved means just informing yourself on what's going on. And I just think that's so important. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. And then also, people can probably, do you guys have any resources where people can go to your website? Do you have anything like that, a website or something people can go to?
No, we don't. But the Center for Community Change has a retirement security website, and we give them that information so they can pull it up. And that's what we use. That's where we get a lot of our facts from. That's what comes. We're not out here by ourselves. We're in the Washington, D.C., Maryland area, but there are people across the country doing what we're doing. And we work together, we communicate together, and all the information is in one central place on the Center for Community Change website, and it's there for anyone who wants to pull it up.
And they can Google that. And now we got about a minute left. So in a minute, if you could say anything you wanted to the radio audience or to your elected officials, what would you tell them about Social Security?
Well, I would tell them that Social Security is the most vital retirement program that we have. Yesterday was the 79th birthday of Social Security, and it's been in existence for 79 years and have never missed a payment while ensuring retirement security for just millions of Americans. A lot of things have fluctuated over the years. A lot of things have failed over the years. You look at it now, pension plans are going away. They're not what they used to be. I read a report the other day, 1 in 5 Americans in the next 10 years are going to be retired with no savings. But Social Security is that one thing that they can be assured of and that they know they're going to have, and they can retire with a little bit of dignity. And that's very important to me. You notice that I use dignity a lot. I just think that people have worked hard all their lives and raised their kids, raised their family, and they deserve to have a little joy and dignity in their life. And people use golden years, so I'm going to use golden years because I'm there myself. It's my golden years for me.
All right. And I'll tell you what, I couldn't agree with you more on the dignity and on the joy. And I'll tell you what, I think when people try to deny other people what's due to them, they rob themselves of their own dignity, too. So a society with dignity, a society with justice, a society with little joy, that's what we're fighting here for. And Julian Blair, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
You too, sir. And we will be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and our next hour, a report from Ferguson. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. You're going to get an invite.
This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the WEACT Radio Network in Washington, D.C. and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to The Zero Hour. In this hour, we are going to be talking about the economic state of siege we face or may be facing in this country. First, we'll be talking with Cole Stangler about his reporting on a new and very underreported trade deal. And then we will be talking with economist Eileen Applebaum about the role of private equity in managing, mismanaging, and taking over American companies. But first, we have with us Cole Stangler. He is a great piano player, a journalist, and a staff writer for In These Times, a Schumann Fellow. He is based in Washington, D.C., covering labor, trade, foreign policy, and environmental issues. And he is here to talk to us. Cole, you did a recent piece. First of all, welcome.
Thanks for having me on again, RJ.
You bet. It's always great to have you on the show, and we always appreciate your reporting. And, you know, people may know about the TPP. They may know about the TPIP. They even may know about Tipitina, the Speaking of Piano Players, the Professor Longhair song. But you wrote recently about something that very few people know about called TISA. Could you just kind of briefly tell us what you found out about it?
So this is called the Trade and Services Agreement, and it's one of these what trade lobbyists and pro-trade people call these 21st century trade agreements, which if you're worried about these kinds of agreements, you say that they're really not about trade. This is about much more than trade. When we think of traditional tariffs, having to get rid of tariffs to facilitate international trade, this is more about facilitating the flow of international capital and about really a corporate power grab. And so I think in that respect, we can think of TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement, similar. It's in the same boat as the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the TTIP, which is this other trade deal the U.S. is signing with the EU. Now, the Trade and Services Agreement is like these agreements in that it goes beyond what we think of being traditional things that you want to negotiate in a trade deal, but it also comes out of a different context. And that context is the ongoing failure of the WTO negotiations, the World Trade Organization, which is all the countries around the world trying to come up with a new trade agreement. And essentially, this has been going on, the so-called Doha round has been going on for about the last decade. And when these talks started around, I think in early 2000s, there was a lot of optimism. People were very excited about them. And they kind of they've basically stalled.
Why were they excited about them, and what are they trying to accomplish with them?
So, I mean, we can think of the next round of WTO talks being another wave of essentially liberalization and kind of what we think of traditionally the WTO doing. But the problem was during those talks, a lot of the countries in the global south, the BRICS, were opposed to essentially some of these more extreme proposals in the service sector. Now, the WTO negotiations cover a lot of different things. Agriculture, for one, there's a lot of controversy around agriculture. The service sector was another big point of disagreement between the U.S. and EU and then the global south. And so essentially what happened was the U.S. and EU are getting frustrated at the lack of progress here. Essentially, these other countries not agreeing to as extreme of a deregulatory agenda that the U.S. and EU wanted. So the U.S. and EU basically said, screw you, we're going to start our own talks. It's not going to be part of the WTO. It's not going to take place under these trade rules that, as problematic as they may be, still have some degree of transparency and accountability because they take place in an international institution. And so the U.S. and EU said, screw you, we're going to go to Geneva and figure out our own services agreement. Now, without Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, you can do things that you can get easy consensus among U.S. and EU corporations. And so they're kind of, right now, the TISA negotiations, it's U.S., EU, and a number of other countries, Australia, Hong Kong, Japan.
So these are essentially just,
yeah.
So just to back up for a second, these are essentially countries that didn't like the transparency, whatever other problems they might have, of the first set of negotiations. So they went off on their own, but it's a lot of countries. We're not talking about a small group. We're talking about the U.S. and maybe 50 other countries?
Correct, yeah. There's about 50 countries right now in the talks. And we think of them being the traditional powerhouses, with the exception, notably, of China. And there's been talk about China potentially joining in. The thing about this is, because you don't have all the world on board with this, the people are thinking maybe if you can come up with a really extreme agreement here, TISA, in a couple of years you'll be able to gradually ease that into the WTO, slowly just peel away countries until you have a bigger block, until eventually you're able to get this thing through the WTO. And that's kind of the long game that people are concerned about.
Yeah. So what does this thing actually do? It amends other trade agreements or replaces them, or what's in it that people should be worried about?
I mean, here's where it gets complicated. The scary part about this is we don't know exactly what's in it. We know some things from reports. So it covers about 70% of global trade and services. And services is everything, it's banking, construction, medical services, telecom, tourism, all of these things. And the only chapter right now that has actually been leaked to the public, thanks to WikiLeaks, and that's the only reason we know about this, was the chapter on financial services. So that kind of provides a glimpse into the kind of agenda that's happening. And I'll give you, so one main concern, and this is a generalization, but one of the main concerns here is that you have these what are called standstill obligations that are being negotiated here to cover the service sector. It sounds really wonky, but it's really important. It means that basically once you commit certain services to this agreement, let's say the United Kingdom, for instance, and part of the EU, let's say they cover health services as part of this agreement, there is a provision of the agreement that, and they're trying to negotiate this across the board, that would lock in whatever agreement is reached on health services, so that any attempts to reverse that, I think the phrase they use are conditions or qualifications on commitments. So any things that you try to put on after the agreement's been signed would then be a violation of the agreement and be subject to an international lawsuit. And that's important.
Okay, so let me try to wrap this all up so far and see, because we're going to run out of time in a minute. But just to make sure I understand, and then I'm just going to say that people should read your reporting about it on in these times. But so a treaty that's covering 70% of world trade, involving 50 countries, involving essentially most of the developed world, that is irrevocable in certain ways, or there's certainly heavy penalties for early withdrawal, as the banks say, is being negotiated in secret, and we're not even talking about it, much less asking to see what's in it. Is that a fair summary?
That is a fair summary. We can have a real discussion about it. The first thing is we need to actually know what's in this agreement. And so we have to have at least that barrier of transparency, and then we can have a broader discussion. But right now, we don't even know exactly what's in this. We know little reports, things that people have gleaned from talking to negotiators, but this is taking place right now, and we don't exactly know what's going on.
So I assume you're gonna stay on top of this, but unless there's a development, this is going to continue to be a secret story for some time to come. So I suppose it's incumbent on the rest of us to create pressure to make it less secret.
That's true. And one other minor point here is that this is one of the underreported travesties of the Obama administration is its willingness to go ahead and negotiate these really extreme trade agreements that we already know, TPP, TTIP, and now TISA, and all these things are going on, under our noses, and the administration is doing it. So I think this is one of their legacies here.
And the only people we have to thank for knowing about this at all apparently is WikiLeaks, who are also now popular with the administration. So,
nope, not at all.
Listen, so I'm going to count on you to keep up the great reporting and to keep us informed on that. And I hope you come back and talk to us again. Cole Stengler, journalist, writer for In These Times and elsewhere, Schumann Fellow. Thanks for coming and talking to us about this really important story.
Thanks as always for having me on.
You bet. I'm Richard RJ Eskow. We'll be right back after this. This is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour. This is Richard R.J. Eskow, and joining us now is Eileen Applebaum. Eileen is senior economist at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. She is also visiting professor in the Department of Management at the University of Leicester in the UK. She has 20 years of experience carrying out empirical research on the effects of public policies and company practices on outcomes for companies and workers. And since I come out of the corporate world, boy, would we have a lot to talk about. She studies work processes and work-life practices of organizations and their implications for effectiveness. Her latest book, of which she is co-author with Rosemary Batt, is Private Equity at Work When Wall Street Manages Main Street. And this is a subject dear to our heart here on the Zero Hour, and not necessarily in a good way. But Eileen, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be here.
I think you've written an important book, and I wanted to talk to you about it, and I wanted to bring it to people's attention. You basically, your subtitle has a thesis buried in it, which is When Wall Street Manages Main Street. So I want to get to that. But first, just for anybody who might not be completely clear, what is private equity?
That's a good question, and let me begin just very briefly describing what private equity is and how it makes money, what it's all about. So private equity, these are firms that raise capital. They raise investment funds largely from pension funds. That's the biggest contributor to the capital of these private equity funds, but also other institutional investors, university endowments, for example, and wealthy individuals. And these folks give their money over to the private equity company, to the fund of the private equity company, and say, here, you have my money for 10 years. You're locking your money up for 10 years. And the private equity firm then takes over completely. The partners, the investors in the fund have no say over what the private equity firm does, what it invests in, how much debt it uses. The private equity fund says, okay, you've given us your money. We're going to make tons of money for you. We're going to buy companies, then we're going to sell them in 3 to 5 years and make lots of money on this. And I think what is really surprising about this is how little money the private equity firm itself has at risk. When they go out and buy a company, the private equity firm has put up less than 1% of the purchase price. But nevertheless, if they're successful when they sell the firm, the private equity firm gets 20% of the winnings. So that's a pretty good deal. And the other thing is that...
As we say, it's nice work if you can get it.
Nice work if you can get it.
And who are some of the major players that people might know, the names people might recognize?
KKR, Blackstone,
Bain.
Carlyle, Bain.
Right.
There's just lots of them. The ones you really know are the ones that in the 1980s were viewed as corporate raiders. We didn't like them very much. They were the barbarians at the gate. But today they've been reinvented as private equity. So they're engaged in a situation in which they can't really lose. They put up a little bit of money. Meanwhile, from the pension funds and everybody else that's invested with them, they collect a management fee, and they get that management fee whether this fund does well or the fund does poorly. So they are basically playing with other people's money. The other important thing that most people find really shocking is that when they buy these companies, these are regular Main Street companies, they load them up with debt. typically 70% of the purchase price is financed with debt. Now, that doesn't, I think when people hear that, they assume that the private equity firm has all that debt, but no. The company that they have bought, they've used the assets of that company as collateral. They've gotten all these debts, and it's the company that has to pay those debts back. And that's really, I think, the most surprising part of it all. So they put up 1% of the money. The pension funds and so on put up 29% of the purchase price. 70% comes from lenders. If you win in a situation like that, if you can sell this company at a profit a few years later, you're going to make out really, really well. And if all this debt that you put on the company leads to go bankrupt, well, that's on the backs of the workers, the company, the creditors, the vendors. Everybody loses except for the private equity firm. So it's
including the people who've been. And when you say everybody loses except the private equity firm, including the people who have invested in that firm.
Not always. Sometimes they come out okay. And I will give you some examples. The main people who bear, because the fund does not have to pay back the loans either, the main burden falls on the workers, the creditors, whoever lent them that 70% of the money, and the vendors.
Well, let's talk about the creditors for a second. The vendors would be the people, obviously, who provided goods or services to the company. The workers would be the people who work for the company. But now the creditors, who are we talking about? Who are some of the big creditors who put up money for these? Are these some of the same?
This is a really hard question to answer because what happens is initially it'll be the big banks that put up the money. It'll be Goldman Sachs and Bank of America, Wells Fargo. All of the big banks put up money for things like this, but as quickly as they can, they securitize it. That means you probably have heard about this before, but they chop it up into pieces and they sell it to the public. The public is not usually you and me. It's usually mutual, but they get to us because it's our mutual funds. You have your money in a 401k. Chances are your 401k is stuffed with these loans. And hedge funds, of course, are another group of financial institutions that will buy these securities. If they can't get rid of the securities fast enough, then the investment bank can be in trouble. And when Lehman Brothers went under, the tax-paying public got to inherit some of these securities. But in general, in pretty quick order, the big banks, the investment banks, can sell them off as securities to hedge funds, mutual funds, wealthy individuals.
So you have a whole series. Somehow the analogy that comes to mind for some reason is dealing Peruvian cocaine in a sense. You have all sorts of middlemen along the way taking a percentage, but they're not the ones out on the street selling it or buying it or using it. All these people between Lima, Peru, and the streets of your city or mine are safe. And they're just taking a transactional fee and walking away from the risk and the damage.
This is
and
true.
It sounds to me.
And I'll tell you what's even
It sounds
more
to me. Sure, go ahead.
Who gets to pay that transactional fee? It's the companies that were bought.
Right.
Not the private equity firm.
So let me give you an example.
Yeah.
I wrote a piece during the 2012 election about Bain and its role in the healthcare business, and Bain and some other private equity firms had purchased. My memory is going to fail me, but a couple
HCA.
of, I think, Duane Reade and another pharmacy chain. These companies were part of, I guess, what would have been called leveraged buyouts at one point, but they were left with an enormous amount of debt, enormous amount of leverage, and then both companies, it was Caremark, I'm not sure, but or CVS or somebody, but both companies engaged in some form of fraud after the transaction had taken place. But one of my speculations was, were their executives, in effect, cornered into fraud almost becoming, whether it's Medicare fraud or another kind, becoming an irresistible temptation because they're so burdened with debt once they get through this process that they can't show a profit unless they have extraordinary results that are almost impossible to achieve. Does any of that make sense?
Well, it does make sense. We'd have to have a lot more detail on the particular cases that you're talking about. They don't really have to resort to that most of the time. Most of the time, they can do it in other ways. They have other ways of making sure that they are profitable. I want to back up and just say that the 20% returns is another story. Let's come back to that later. What kind of returns do you actually make if you're a pension fund and you've invested with private equity? So they don't necessarily make these really huge returns. But let's get down. You're really asking me a question about the operation of that Main Street company and what's going to happen there.
Right. And what I want to do, Eileen, is I want to take a quick break, and then we'll talk about, I want to talk in a little more detail about how it does affect the operations of those companies. So we will be right back after this with Eileen Applebaum, economist, author of Private Equity at Work. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour with Eileen Applebaum, economist and co-author of Private Equity at Work, When Wall Street Manages Main Street. We've been talking about private equity funds, and how does it turn out that these Wall Street operations wind up managing Main Street corporations? Right.
Well, what happens is they load the companies up with debt. That is correct, and that very much constrains what the local managers can do. So you're absolutely correct about that. And they give the local managers a 100-day plan, which in some cases is next to impossible to achieve. But they also say to these managers, if you can make this work, we are going to make you really rich. Those who make it work, fine, and those who don't make it work are quickly replaced by the private equity firm who have a cadre of managers that are loyal to them. They can just plunk them into your company to run your company. They don't really care about the company, but they do care about the returns. And there are many ways without having to skirt the law at all that they can make money. Of course, the first one is they say to the workers, well, we have to pay this debt back. If we don't pay the debt back, none of us is going to have a job. So you'll have to give concessions. They get wage concessions. They get benefit concessions. The second thing they do, that there's this mythology that they go out and turn around underperforming companies. If we have more time, I could talk about that. But if they bought a company and it has units that are underperforming, they don't invest in it and bring it up to speed. They just get rid of it. So they sell it off. That's the second thing that they do. And those workers either do or don't have a job at the end of it. A third thing that they do is because they've loaded the company up with debt and because interest is tax deductible in the U.S., the company's tax returns, their tax liabilities go down, and we, the taxpayers, are subsidizing that operation. The other thing.
All right, I want to. You're giving us a lot of information here.
There are many legal ways. They don't. Some of them do resort to fraud. I'm sure. If we had more information, we could talk about that. But they don't have to resort to fraud. Their model works by. There's two ways you can make money. One is you can put productive resources to work and grow the economic pie, and then you're the profit taker. Your share of the pie goes up with everybody else's. Or you can engage in financial engineering and collect rents. You can increase your slice of the pie at everybody else's expense.
Right.
And I will say in the book we do have good cases. I just wanted to back up and say that for a minute. But they show up in the smaller companies with an enterprise value. I know this doesn't sound that small, but $25 million, $50 million, up to about $300 million. Those companies are basically family-owned. They're not professionally managed. They don't have good access to finance. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit. And on the other hand, they don't have much in the way of assets that you can mortgage. So when private equity takes over these smaller companies, they use much less debt, and they actually have low-hanging fruit. They can improve the operation and sell the company. And we have examples of that in the book where, in fact, it's a win-win. But most of what private equity does, the main money that they put into taking over Main Street companies goes into big companies. They're already professionally managed. They already have good accounting systems and IT systems. But what they also have are lots of assets that can be mortgaged. And that's where the private equity makes the money in the way that we've been talking about.
And in those cases, what you're describing is a little bit, what sometimes gets called vulture economics. You get the idea that 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 if a company is already professionally managed, has well-developed systems, processes, procedures, and so on, and I used to be involved in some of this work myself, so I know that the only way you can turn a profit in a scenario like this is, in effect, by what's the analogy? Burning the furniture to keep warm. You sell the assets. You do things that provide short-term returns that benefit, let's say, the private equity fund, but in the long run aren't good for the company or the economy.
And
right?
so there are two ways that they do that. One is they are the shareholders, they're in charge of this company. They can have the company, they can tell the company, go out and sell junk bonds. So companies now saddled with even more debt, and use the money not to invest in the company, but to pay us a dividend. And so that's one way that they take resources out of the company, resources that the company needs to pay its workers, to modernize its plant, to keep up with the competition. They just take that money right out. And the second is what you were just talking about, and we have an example just from 2 months ago. I don't know whether you followed the Red Lobster story. But,
I did.
Yeah, so here's Red Lobster, owned by one of the largest casual restaurant companies in the world, and some hedge funds buy shares in it, and they want to make money. And the Darden management, in a fight with them, but anyway, Darden management decides that it's going to sell off Red Lobster. Red Lobster produces lots of revenue, but its same-store sales are falling. It's profitable, but it's not as profitable as it used to be, and profits aren't growing. So they sell Red Lobster, which is already having trouble growing and competing. They sell it to Golden Gate Capital in May for $2.1 billion. And on that same morning, Golden Gate Capital announces that it has sold the real estate of 500 of those restaurants to a real estate investment trust, and those restaurants are now going to have to pay rent in order to continue operating in the same locations where they've always been operating. So if their cash flow and their earnings were not that great before they sold the real estate out from under them, they're going to cut those earnings in half. Their net earnings are going to be cut in half. Their ability to pay a decent wage to their workers, their ability to modernize their menu, upgrade their menu, where will they get the resources to do that? So the private equity fund has already repaid itself for 3/4 of the price of the company, and as we know, its investors and lenders may have money at risk, but the firm itself has very little. So at this point, if Red Lobster survives, well, that'll be gravy. But if it doesn't survive,
First they came for Red Lobster, and I said nothing. Then they came for the Olive Garden. Listen, and speaking of restaurants, it reminds me, I'm going to segue to the next topic by saying it reminds me of the old joke about such terrible food and such small portions. You'd think with practices like this that they'd be beating the stock market right and left. But your book, one of the observations you make is that at least in recent years, they don't even necessarily do better than the stock market.
That's right. That's right. And they haven't beaten the stock market since 2005. So it's not a good investment. And here's what's happening. I can give you one example. The Michael Stores example. So Michael Stores was bought by private equity the last time we had a stock market peak, and they overpaid for it, which private equity is doing today as well. They overpaid for it. They couldn't sell it in 3 to 5 years. They finally sold it in June of this year after holding it for almost 8 years. They made a return on it, and if we assume that they could sell all the shares and so on, and we just give them every benefit of every doubt, what we would find is that the pension funds that invested in Michael Stores, that were part of that fund, will get a return of between 6.5 and 7.8%. I can't give you a precise answer because they are not transparent, and I have to make some assumptions. But 6.5 to 7.8% is the range where it's going to be, and that sounds really good. Hey, we made 7.8%. But if you take a look at the stock market and had put that same money in the stock market over this almost 8 years, the stock market returned more than 8.1%. So the pension funds, this is not even like the most terrible story, but the pension funds have tied up their money for 8 years. It's illiquid. They couldn't do other things with it. It's much riskier because of all the debt that's been put on Michael Stores, and which Michael Stores still has. So we don't know that they're going to be able to sell all the stock that they still own in it, but giving them every benefit of the doubt, their investment in Michael Stores underperformed the stock market, which is not risky or much less risky and completely liquid. So it made no sense. But in general, that's what's been happening. And right now, the worst time to be investing in private equity if you're a pension fund is when the stock market is at a peak. Right now, what's happening with the stock market at a peak, as Leon Black, the CEO of Apollo Private Equity, what he said is we are selling everything that's not nailed down because the prices are high, you can get lots of money, and they're getting the lots of money, and they're distributing it to the pension funds. And the pension funds are getting these buckets of money, and they say, oh, my God, a bucket of money. I'm going to put it right back into private equity. But they haven't asked themselves, how does this compare with what I could have gotten in the market? And I'm going to give you a simple example that's easy to understand. It's not the best kind of an example because you can't really judge based on 1 year. But it'll let you see what's happening. So in the last fiscal year, CalPERS just put out its results. And in the last...
CalPERS being the pension fund for California employees.
That's the California Employees Pension Fund, public employees.
Right.
It's the biggest pension fund in the country. And CalPERS has been in private equity for a very long time and is considered a leader among investing and knowing how to invest in private equity. And so they found that over the last fiscal year, their investments in private equity returned 20%. That sounds fabulous until you ask the question, what did their investments in the stock market return? And they told us that those returned 24.8%. So as good as it looks when you're getting these buckets of money back, you have to ask, am I getting more than I would have gotten if I had put it in the stock market? Because if not, why am I paying all those management fees to have people manage my money and give me a return that's worse than what I could get on my own just by putting my money in the stock market?
And why are you locking it up for 10 years when you could be have access to it at any time?
Exactly.
So this is you and your co-author, I believe. This is quoting you. We learned in the financial crisis that history is not the strong suit of seemingly sophisticated financial market actors, which shows you have a sense of humor too. That's good, but or a sense of irony. But there's truth to that. And so I guess the question is, look, individual investors who go into these private equity funds have to put up a lot of money. They have to be quite wealthy by most people's standards. And then you have the pension funds and other institutional investors. Why aren't they smarter about this?
You know, this is a very good question, and it is perplexing. I have to say that. And I think what does it is that the top 25% of funds do, in fact, beat the market by a pretty good margin. It's all the rest of them that don't do so well. If you go back to the 1990s, and maybe just the 1990s, top quartile funds were the top 25% funds in the top 25% could repeat that achievement, but that's no longer true. So you have no idea who's going to be in the top 25%. But if you were in one of those funds, you would do pretty well. So we know that, let's just think about the pension funds. We know that 3/4 of them are not going to do very well, but 1/4 of them are going to do just great. And either they all believe they're going to be in that top quartile, or for some of them, I think is like a Hail Mary pass. They say, well, you know, we're underfunded. Our pension fund is underfunded. If we do, we know that we're likely to lose, but if we were to win, wouldn't that be great? So I just think it's a kind of fuzzy thinking about what you really can expect to get out of these kinds of investments. So I think there are two things going on. One is that most of the investors are not sophisticated enough to be able to make a real comparison with what the stock market has done. And they believe what the private equity funds tell them. They believe what the consultants tell them. And most of the time, what they're being told is based on a faulty measure called the internal rate of return, which is easy to manipulate and which is not a very good measure of returns. When you do an accurate comparison with what happened to the stock market, you find that at least in recent years, the private equity funds have underperformed the stock market at the median, and only if you can get into those top funds, which you never know what they're going to be in advance, would you have done better.
You'd think with so much money at stake they'd figure this out, but human psychology is a fascinating thing, and I guess in the few minutes we have left, a couple other things I wanted to raise. We keep talking about pension funds, for example, as being major institutional investors, and yet if you step back and look at this at the macro level, these pension funds, in effect, aren't really working in the interests of the employees and retired employees they're meant to serve, are they? Because they're encouraging an economy that's based on, what you want to call it, rentier or financial manipulation, and they're investing in a strategy that leads, in many cases, to the widespread loss of jobs, which hurts the working people's economy. So aren't they, in effect, being short-sighted? I mean, I don't want to knock them because they've got a tough job.
They're in a conflict. Unions are very conflicted over private equity. There's no question about it. And I think part of it is that they have bought into the idea that, well, we need the money for our pension funds. We have to get it somewhere, and private equity is going to do it for us. And, in fact, that in recent years has not really worked out that way. CalPERS is cutting back its investment in private equity, its allocation, but many other pension funds are increasing their allocation, especially right now with all this money coming back. And we can predict that the private equity funds launched now are not going to do well. They are overpaying for the companies. I mean, they're paying more for companies today in relation to earnings than they did in 2008 and 2007 and the last time the stock market was rising like this. So they're overpaying for the companies, which means it's going to be really hard to exit these investments at a profit. And they're loading them up with debt, which means that if we have another recession, it's going to be a really serious problem. I mean, the bankruptcy rates are... Yeah, sorry.
No. There's so much we could be saying about this, but in the minute and a half we have left, I'm going to pull a dirty trick on you a little bit and say, are there any public policy solutions to this?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. If I only have a minute, I'll just say them quickly. I think the most important thing we have to do is limit the amount of debt that they can put on companies in order to limit risk. And we can do that by limiting the tax deductibility of interest. Why should they be able to put as much debt as they want, have as much interest payments, and take it off their tax bill? So the rest of us have to pick up the difference. Right. We could have a situation where loans to companies are limited so that you can't give a company more in debt than it could reasonably be expected to repay over a 5-year period. Or we could expand the regulatory oversight. This is what they've done in Europe, so that the regulators look at the debt that the private equity firms have put on the companies and decide whether it's too risky, and they can make the private equity companies do something else. We need to close the tax loophole. Right now, private equity partners get to pay much lower tax rate on their winnings than the rest of us get to pay on our income. We should stop that. And we need to update employment law, bankruptcy law, and pension law, because the way the world looks at private equity is that it's a financial firm. These are financial transactions. And the whole point of our book is to show that actually they're not just financial transactions. They are actually out there managing the companies that they've taken over. They're giving it the business strategy, the direction, the amount of debt, and they need to be held accountable if as a result of this, companies crash and burn. They need to be accountable for the pension payments, for severance payments, for the WARN Act, for all of the things that other employers are responsible for.
Excellent overview. And with that, thanks so much for joining us, Eileen Applebaum, Senior Economist at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, visiting professor at someplace in the UK. We're running out of money. And co-author of Private Equity at Work, When Wall Street Manages Main Street. Thanks so much for joining us, Eileen.
It's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed this.
Me too. And we will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. All right, Eileen, we made it. Okay, guess we lost Eileen.
No, I'm here. I hear you.
Okay, all right, good. I can hear you.
Okay, I was just
yeah, well,
saying
thanks
it
so
was
much.
This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the WeAct Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
Hello, everybody. One nation under siege. One city under a lockdown. In this hour, a special zero-hour report from our producer, Pete Callahan, on the ground there in Ferguson, Missouri. Special interviews and hopefully some surprise reports as well as we update ourselves and you on the ever-changing situation there in Ferguson. And before we get started, a couple comments. You know, a lot has been written this week about the transfer of used military equipment from the armed forces to police departments like Ferguson's all around the country. But this movement of physical resources has been accompanied by a psychological shift, too, a shift in public thinking, which has been driven by everything from popular culture to the news media. How often do we hear, for example, the good news about crime in America's cities? How often do we hear statistics like these? Give you one. From 1993 to 2012, overall violent crime, violent victimization declined from a rate of 79.8% per thousand people to 26.1%. From 1993 to 2011, the rate of homicides declined by 48%, from 9.9 to 5.1 homicides per 100,000 people. These numbers come from the most recent Justice Department report on criminal victimization. But how often do you see them on the news or read them in the headlines? Instead of that, we're treated to an endless stream of violent imagery. As several reports this week have indicated, the transfer of weapons from the Pentagon to domestic police departments has contributed quite a bit to the militarization of America's streets. And as Zed Jelani reports, Congress had a chance to stop that process when a bill co-sponsored by Democratic Representative Alan Grayson with the support of Republican Justin Amash was introduced in the House a couple months ago. But the Democratic and Republican leadership were against it and it failed. So that's a factor, this flood of military equipment onto our streets. The post-9/11 spike in national security spending has also been a major factor. The Department of Homeland Security keeps dispensing weaponry, eavesdropping equipment, and training to police departments all across the country of a very military nature. So we have to ask ourselves, who benefits from all of this? Well, defense contractors certainly do, since they can now argue that their products are used in the nation, for the nation, both abroad and then at home. So it gives them a new sales pitch. It also gives them new markets for direct sales to police forces and for selling replacement parts, ammunition, and other supplies. So they benefit. There's also political benefit for politicians whose ideology and presentation is based primarily on fear. We also saw this police-military complex heavily on display during the height of the Occupy movement, and a number of elected officials undoubtedly breathed a sigh of relief when the police's efforts against Occupy finally splintered that movement or drove it underground or certainly made it less visible. There's benefit for the media, too, since sensationalism is good for their business. In a disturbing segment we first reviewed last September, 60 Minutes offered what amounted to an infomercial for the militarization of the American police force in a segment entitled Counterinsurgency Cops. Here's some of the things we noted back then. The Cops episode featured footage of urban police in full military gear, carrying rifles with night scopes and kicking down the doors of an American home. Leslie Stahl led the audience through a manipulative exercise which began with her telling her viewers that foreign counterinsurgency turned soldiers into, quote, warriors and community builders, going village to village, driving out insurgents while winning the hearts and minds of the population, quote. But, Stahl continues, we met a Green Beret who is finding out in his job as a police officer that this strategy might actually have a better chance of working right here at home in the USA. Yes, they actually said that on CBS. And this is straight from the official CBS script. Here's what Leslie Saul said. Call him and his fellow officers counterinsurgency cops, exclamation point. The exclamation point is in the script. They're not fighting Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, but street gangs and drug dealers in one of the most crime-ridden cities in New England. As much as intuition might tell you otherwise, CBS seems to find nothing controversial about fighting suspected gang members or drug dealers who are legally only suspects with the same techniques used to fight those who are presumably enemy combatants on a foreign field of battle. So we could talk more about this. The Green Beret who she interviews is a state trooper named Mike Coutone. We're told that, quote, after returning from Iraq, Coutone had an aha moment when he was talking to a gas station manager in Springfield. You know, it goes on to say Coutone thought that Springfield was just like the situations he faced in Iraq, and he wrote a memo to his police chief, et cetera, et cetera. What Leslie Slaw didn't tell anybody was that this guy promotes himself with all of this stuff. He didn't think of it by himself. The American Civil Liberties Union has been studying the militarization of American police forces for years. Author Radley Balco has been writing about it going back many years. So it's not something that was dreamed up in one police officer's head. It's a trend that's taken place for the reasons that we've explained, because people benefit from it. But to hear 60 Minutes tell the story, counterinsurgency tactics just began with an aha moment. So look, at the end of the day, they're writing papers like Using Counterinsurgency Tactics, Techniques, and Procedures to Defeat Gangs in U.S. Cities. They've been doing it. They were doing that when this Mike Coutone guy was still overseas. So this is a process that's been ongoing, that's been the militarization of the American people as one general observed when you're protecting a crowd, as the police were supposedly doing in Ferguson. You don't point your weapons at the crowd. You point your weapons away from the crowd. That's not what's been happening in Ferguson. Now, in the last 24 hours, we've seen quite a turnaround. We'll ask Pete and the others about that. We've seen a turnaround as a new officer was brought in to take charge of the situation and immediately expressed his solidarity with the community. That's what should be happening all along. That's what we should see more of. We hope America learns a lesson from this, and we hope we can get an update that's informative for you as well as us when we come back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and joining us now is our very own executive producer, Pete Callahan, who has been on the ground for about 24 hours there in Ferguson, Missouri, where the situation has changed dramatically in the last day or so. Pete, how are you doing?
I'm pretty good, RJ. How are you?
I'm not bad, thanks. Good to have you. Good to hear your voice. So what's going on down there? What are you seeing?
So last night we got here about 10 o'clock or so and went right out and to the main strip where all the protests and actions going on. And it was a very, very young crowd, very active crowd. There was people riding on the street on the tops of cars, all holding their hands up, don't shoot is one of the big slogans they're using. No justice, no peace, you hear a lot of as well, things like that. And basically, like, the whole area, and then people from surrounding areas are all just, like, massed here to basically, like, show their disgust in what happened to this kid who was 2 days away from going to college, basically, and who was shot by police pretty much totally senseless.
Okay, so we've got the hands up and don't shoot is wasn't that supposed to be what Michael Brown said to the officers before they shot him?
Yes, and it's different. Reports differ. So actually, it might have been after they shot him once already or shot at him. There's now been reports from the neighborhood that they found also stray bullets that look like the 9mm bullets that the police in Ferguson carry. And so yes, that's exactly where it comes from.
So, and that honking that we just heard in the background, where are you now?
So I am, I've been set up all morning doing live streaming for Credo Mobile. and React Radio, and I'm in front of the mini mart they burned down about 3 nights ago. And this is kind of ground zero for a lot of the other news crews, as well as ground zero for where everyone's massing the protest. And compared to last night, the crowd's a lot older and a tiny bit more docile, but still mad as all hell.
So the honking are people honking in support of the demonstrators?
Yeah. It's yeah, so there's demonstrators on the street holding signs, and people white and black are all honking their horns. And there's lots of news crews doing stand-ups and community activists. There's people from the community that are pissed off, scared, because they worry about their child or themselves or their sister or their brother, ending up like Mike Brown.
Right. Now, about that. Now, the police just released their report not too long ago, and I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it, but they promised
It was 9 a.m. local time this morning when they released it. I've looked it over, talked to some other journalists and community members who studied it more thoroughly than I, and it seems like they're trying to play misdirection more than anything else with this, and that while they just admitted in a press conference that was happening right up until this call started, basically, that yes, the officer was responding to allegations, not to allegations, but reports of an armed robbery or a shoplifting incident, but he still, even though he was responding to that, he ended up, basically yelling at Mike Brown to get out of the street. He was walking in the street, and that's how that altercation started. Now their police are also saying that Michael Brown was the perpetrator, and basically what they're saying is that he stole like 1 or 2 cigarillos, small cigars, often, honestly, used to smoke marijuana with, to smoke as a cigar, but it was like something that cost like, $1.50. And so now that they're trying to slander this kid who did well in high school and was on his way to college in a community where not everyone goes to college, so they're even angrier now than they were before. And they also
that's what I was going to ask you. That's exactly what I wanted to get to ask you, which was, what was the reaction to this? Clearly, they're saying, and they released video that showed somebody looking like they took some cigars or something, but they're clearly trying to say that he was a suspect before this altercation happened, which, of course, in this country, even if you're a suspect, that's not licensed to shoot somebody. But what I was going to ask you was, how are people reacting? And it could well be what you described, which is a kind of slandering of the victim. But how are people? How does that alter the mood? Because, we saw the reports last night that seemed to indicate the tension had really been lifted. The police were not being aggressive anymore. This new Commander Johnson had come in. And people.
So the governor called in the Highway Patrol and kind of tried to relieve the St. Louis police of their duty. And me and Seth, other guy on the ground here, tried to talk to some of the St. Louis County police and ask them how they were feeling. And they seemed pretty angry to be guarding the outposts for the Highway Patrol who were relieving their job. Also, though, in the press conference that just happened, the district attorney admitted that. While Michael Brown may or may not have, shoplifted a couple cigars, he also wasn't at the time, or the officer at the time when he confronted him, it didn't consider him the suspect they were looking for. So it still kind of doesn't really help anything. And on top of all that, we have an issue where people are just looking at now pictures of this cop. And I also think the other one that I missed right now was that they didn't release the video initially, and they just said in the new press conference they're going to release the actual video at some point. We're not sure when. They only released stills from the video that showed him possibly stealing a couple cigars. So everyone here is much, much, much madder than they were last night, especially the elders community and a lot of the people that have been doing activist type and community support type stuff their whole lives. Went from being let's come together. There's a lot of unity here, and everyone's black men should be killing black men, and police shouldn't be shooting them because they think we're all criminals. And that's kind of the bottom line right now. I'm actually pretty worried about what might happen tonight, even with the new police force, because the district attorney and the attorney general are now saying it could be illegal for the governor to relieve county sheriffs of their command and bring in state troops.
So, and about that, Pete, we're talking with Pete Callahan on the ground in Ferguson, Missouri. About that, I was watching some of the television coverage last night, and I could definitely see what seemed to be tension between the state police and the local police, where they even had, two state police officers went to talk to a news crew, and then a white guy from the local police force, a white police officer, came and kind of tried to inject himself into that conversation. And I just got the sense that there might be tension between these two police forces. Any sense of that where you are?
There's actually a lot of that. So we tried to talk to some of the local cops last night, and they were obviously very unhappy that they were no longer really being active. Like, they were all, a large number of them were all basically stacked up in this parking lot that was cordoned off, basically, and probably told to just stay there. And so there's very, very little idea on the ground right now who is actually in control, who has jurisdiction over things. I've talked to other journalists and people on the ground, stuff like that, and really, there's very little idea who's actually in control here. And as more facts come out, and as it seems like the local authorities maybe obfuscating the truth, or these will affect that, tensions are rising, and the last thing you want in a situation like that is to have no idea who's actually in charge.
Oh, for sure. And so there's a court. You're saying there's some sort of legal challenge now to whether the governor is allowed to do what he did of bringing these state police in to take control of the situation?
Yes. The local authorities, I think, don't really like the idea, or the precedent especially, that their local control can be usurped by the governor. And even though it works very well comparatively to how it was working before, I think that between the ranks of police and the local politicians and people like that, that there is a lot of tension between those and those that were brought in to do the job they usually do. And so, yeah, it's very worrisome. Last night, I wasn't really that worried. It seemed when we got on the ground, even though, we both brought helmets and gas masks, that we were getting here towards, the end of it. We were getting here towards the more kumbaya moment. But now, after this morning, it seems like that, we could really see some more violence heat up here.
And what's the kind of feeling or vibration you get off the people around you? I mean, obviously there's a lot of unity, as you said, a lot of solidarity, and you're saying a lot of anger too. So,
and it's not just black people that are angry. There's white local people that are angry. There's college students from WashU and St. Louis, places like that are here, and they're all standing side by side saying, we can't allow this to keep happening in America. And that is in many ways a beautiful thing. The issue with it is that a lot of people are also not necessarily that opposed to, burning down businesses that they feel are taking money out of their communities and exploiting their communities. Like, they burned down a liquor store last night. They burned down this mini-mart we've been standing in front of. And while we hear a lot of very, very peaceful things towards the protesters themselves and how, we should all take care of each other, kind of like almost Woodstocky in that sense, they also are all very, very bad at the authorities, and it's starting to spill over towards the state police as well. And so the force that came in to try to replace the force that was making all the problems really is also now becoming untrusted by the protesters and locals, which could spell disaster later on tonight. During the day, I'm not that worried at all. At night, a couple times last night, I actually had someone try to steal my camera at one point because they were worried I was a cop. We took care of that situation.
All right, Pete?
And diffused it. I know.
Pete?
I usually get mistaken for a cop. Yeah, RJ, you there?
Right. We're going to have to go to break, but can we get you back in about 20 minutes?
Yeah, I'd love to. Just give me a call.
Okay. All right. Take care of yourself, and we'll be back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow. We will be back. This is the 0 Hour.
to the We Act Radio Network, produced in Washington, D.C. Visit us online at weactradio.com or at youtube.com/weactradiodc.
I had a sore in my mouth that just wouldn't go away. And after a couple of weeks, I went to my doctor.
A sore, lump, or thick patch in your mouth or throat could be a symptom of oral cancer.
My doctor told me I was smart to come in. He said that oral cancer is more common in African American men than in any other group in the U.S. It turns out I did have oral cancer, but it was caught early and my treatment was successful. I'm glad I got it checked. That probably saved my life.
If you're an African American man, you need to know about oral cancer. Visit a doctor or dentist if you see changes in your mouth that don't go away after 2 weeks. It's important to get an oral cancer exam, because if you do have cancer, the earlier it's caught, the better. A message from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, National Institutes of Health.
Jeff, I'm home.
Hey, Mom.
So, what did you do today? I noticed the dishes are still in the sink.
I've been busy.
Getting your taxes done like we talked about?
Oh, I got my friend Dave on that. Hey, he's only charging $20.
Not Dave from your high school class who graduated 3 years late.
Yeah, he's good with numbers. Won our fantasy football league last year.
Jeff, I can't believe you would actually take your...
Kidding, Mom. I took all my paperwork over to that preparer just like you recommended.
Using a paid tax preparer this year? Visit irs.gov for some do's and don'ts. Like, look for a preparer who has a preparer tax ID number and signs your return. Check out their qualifications and review your tax return before you sign it.
Oh, Jeff, why do you do this to me?
Mom, you're just so easy.
irs.gov. It's the best tax tip of all.
You know, this used to be a good neighborhood. Now it's a mess. You got all these polyps running around. Stick it in the devil.
Colon cancer almost always starts with a polyp. Get the polyp early and stop colon cancer before it even starts.
Where do you think you were running to, huh? I didn't even see you guys there. I don't know.
Get the test, get the polyp.
I want to talk to my lawyer!
Get the cure.
I got a phone call! CD is for everybody, not just for the few. Anyone can share VD with someone nice as you.
If you're curious or confused, get information or a pamphlet at most pharmacies or a health clinic. If you need help, see a doctor.
Would you like to secure stable employment, affordable, high-quality child care, or an opportunity to serve your community through meaningful volunteer and internship experiences? If so, UPO is the place for you. Hello, I'm Andrea Thomas, Vice President of Administration and Chief of Staff for UPO. As the Community Action Agency for Washington, D.C., UPO has proudly served the residents of Washington for the past 50 years. Annually, we impact the lives of nearly 100,000 Washingtonians, 100,000 people advancing their education, securing employment, maintaining housing stability, and investing in their communities through volunteerism. Our vision is a Washington of thriving communities and self-sufficient residents. To learn more about our services and how you can partner with us or donate, visit us at www.upo.org. UPO, where we are uniting people with opportunities.
And we are back on the Zero Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and joining us now is Ryan Grimm. Ryan is the Washington bureau chief for the Huffington Post. He's a former staff reporter with Politico.com and the Washington City Paper. He's won several awards for his journalism, and now he's responsible for the bureau as well. And Ryan, thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So listen, it's always a principle that journalists and news outlets don't ever want to be the story. But in Ferguson, the Huffington Post became the story. And what do you think? Do you think that Ryan, what was his name? Was Ryan O'Reilly? Is that right?
Just Riley.
And so, just Riley. I'm sorry.
Yep.
Okay, Ryan Riley was a member of your team who was arrested down there, along with Lowry from the Washington Post, and that seemed to be, both those guys were great about pointing out the injustice of this, but the notion of turning on reporters seemed to shift public opinion and political opinion. Some people think that's the reason why the state police were brought in. Do you have any thoughts on that, or observations, or information?
Yeah, somebody put together a Twitter map, kind of a heat map that shows how many mentions there were of Ferguson over this week, and right around the time, shortly after they got arrested, you just kind of see an explosion of it. And I think that part of it is that you're looking at a case that's a bit of a he said, she said. The community and the people who witness are saying that Michael Brown was killed in a certain fashion, and the police are saying it happened in a completely different fashion, and like they say in every movie, that he lunged for the gun, and so that you've got this. Some people might say, well, look, it's kind of gray. Well, we'll wait to weigh in until we get some more information here. But then you find the police assaulting and arresting journalists who, by their nature are credible. When they put something in the paper, people believe it because that's what they do with their craft. It's not he said, she said at that point. This is a fact that's being reported. So when they go and they arrest journalists, then I think people start to think, well, one of these sides is a pretty bad actor here, and so it ends up casting doubt on their already implausible argument for what happened, and at the same time, it raises questions about militarization of policing and civil liberties in general. People, I think, who were only tangentially tuning in immediately noticed the camouflage and the assault weapons and the tanks and the all the other bang bang toys that the police brought out to the protest. And then on top of that, you see some journalists get arrested, and you say, wait a minute, this is not something that happens in the United States of America.
Right, and I think also, I mean, they're both guys talked about the racial implications of them being white and so on, but I also think there's something about sitting with your lap.
Black, actually.
Oh, okay. Ryan talked about that.
Ryan talked a lot about that. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's something about whatever your ethnicity, about the idea that you're sitting in a Starbucks on your laptop. I just think a lot of people can identify with that experience as somebody then coming in and hassling you, go this way, no, go that way, slamming you into a Coke machine in Lowry's case, or the glass wall in Ryan's case, I think it was. So I think there's that. But where are you now? Are you in Washington, or are you?
I'm in Washington. Yeah.
So what are you hearing today from your guys there? Is Ryan there? Do you have other guys there?
Yeah, so Ryan and Christine Canetta, a HuffPost Live producer, reporter, is out there with him. And she actually had maybe a much tougher time than Ryan had, because she was cut off from him by the police phalanx. He had everything, their car keys, all the equipment, and then the police fired tear gas, which pushed her and other people deep into the outer neighborhood, miles and miles and miles away from where she needed to get, and couldn't cross town because of the tear gas that they kept shooting. And actually, somebody on Twitter that we found finally went out and picked her and Brian up and took them back to their car that was still parked at the McDonald's at like 1 a.m. So that was kind of a harrowing experience for her. But so they're both out there, and what they're experiencing is that the different approach to policing has had a dramatic change on the mood there. when they kicked out the locals and brought in the highway patrol, and the highway patrol met them with hugs and handshakes and marched with them, and they showed up in their the kind of normal police garb that we've been used to seeing police in for a couple hundred years, or at least we think we're used to it, because the militarization is a lot a lot more prevalent than we'd like to think, and that changed the entire dynamic. The people were not looking to loot or to riot, and so absent the police violence, it was a very peaceful night and another peaceful day so far.
Well, so I hear, but we have a guy on the ground there too who's telling us that since the police report came out claiming that Michael Brown committed a crime just before the incident and his death, he says attention is rising again. I don't know if you're hearing that from your folks there.
Yes, no question. The tension is rising, and there's a ton of anger that's still there. There's no question about that. The anger hasn't gone away, but the violence was very much one-sided, and so now that one side has stopped being violent, it's become much more peaceful. Now, there's no saying where it goes in the future, but as of now, there's lots of anger and tension, but nobody's acting violently.
Have your folks done any analysis on a sort of forward-looking situation, how long this series of confrontations, demonstrations, and so on might be expected to go on, or is it just anybody's guess right now?
It's anybody's guess at this point. There still is the autopsy that needs to be released, and so that will kind of trigger some more tension as if the story is accurate that he was shot in the back and as he was running, and then you'll be able to count the number of times that he was shot and where and from what range. So that still remains to happen, and this release of this videotape, even though the police are now saying it is completely unrelated to why the police stopped Michael Brown, yet they released it anyway, has certainly tossed some gasoline on the situation.
Right, especially if they say it's unrelated, it seems all the more inflammatory because it seems like character assassination of a dead person, doesn't it?
Right. Now, he said, the police chief said, well, I had to release it. Journalists were asking for it. I can only assume that the journalists who are asking for it, if that's true, learned of it, through police leaks. That happens where somebody will tell me, hey, you should file a FOIA for X. And then I'll file the FOIA, and then boom, there I got what the source wanted to give me. Otherwise, I don't know how else anybody would have known to even ask for this. His friend was up front about what happened at the convenience store when he spoke to federal investigators. So authorities would have known about this, even absent the video. But no, he said, I was forced to release this because of the freedom of information, et cetera. So great for him and his transparency. Nobody forced him to, hold a press conference and, hold up stills and go through a whole dog and pony show to draw attention to it. The police department continues to be criticized from all parts of the spectrum, left to right, for its incompetence here.
I think to look for a historical parallel to this, and other people have done this, I think we really do need to go back 50 years to Little Rock and some of the other places where you had one jurisdiction's police force in conflict with another, acting at cross purposes, and God knows where it all heads. But listen, Ryan Grimm, Washington Bureau Chief for the Huffington Post, an institution I know well. Thanks so much for joining us. I wish your guys safety out there, as I wish my own, and thanks so much for coming on the show and talking about it.
Hey, and thank you for all your contributions. We always appreciate them. Great stuff.
Thanks, man. Thank you very much. And we will be back right after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. Joining us once again is our reporter on the ground, our producer, Pete Callahan. There in Ferguson, Missouri. Pete, any update?
So, yeah, I've actually gotten out of where I was now and driven around a little more. I'm in a car at the moment and kind of seen some of the damage from the night before. It looks like it was mostly businesses that weren't owned by the community. And it's building right now. It's people are starting to go to work. It's Friday afternoon, and people have been watching the news from work, obviously, and they're pissed, and they're taking to the streets.
They're pissed. That's the word you're using. So,
like, they're extremely, extremely angry about what's going on, and the way, like, not like to a man, everyone seems like that. You know, the authorities are obfuscating the truth on purpose, to try to cover it up. And there's nothing worse than something like this happening than to have the authorities handle it very, very poorly.
All right. So, well, first and foremost, stay safe out there. And I'm going to read a couple things, and I'm just interested in your response to it. Palestinians have begun sharing advice with protesters in Ferguson. I don't know if you've heard about that there, but from Occupied here are some tweets. From Occupied Palestine, we stand with the oppressed in Ferguson. Another, made in USA tear gas canister was shot at us a few days ago in Palestine by Israel. Now they are used by Ferguson in Ferguson and Missouri. And then they tweeted advice. Don't get too far from the police. If you're close to them, they can't tear gas you. Always make sure to run against the wind and keep calm when you're tear gassed. The pain will pass. So our demonstrators there are aware of this sort of thing, whether it's from Palestine or anywhere else in the world, that people have been expressing support for them elsewhere in the country and elsewhere in the world?
I hadn't heard about that specifically, but I have heard among people on the ground a lot of parallels between what's going on in Gaza and occupied Palestinian territories in Israel and what's going on here. A lot of the references are to American empire that's turned on anything that's black or brown, basically. And they're using, military hardware to occupy a area that is predominantly black with white forces that are armed to the teeth and look like stormtroopers. So that's the one thing. On the other hand, the rubber bullet thing, which has been for years done by the Israeli army to quell protesting and stuff like that, where you shoot rubber bullets usually, like you're supposed to shoot rubber bullets at center mass, you don't hurt someone. You can still give someone a heart attack that way, but you're not going to maim someone. And so they've been saying that just like in Israel, these guys have been shooting to maim. So they're shooting headshots, they're shooting arm shots, femurs. They're trying to maim people just like they are in Palestine here. And the people on the ground are very aware of that and drawing lots of parallels to it. And the military hardware aspect, which also worries me about what's going on tonight, because the state police and the local police are massed in this big parking lot and shopping center, and they're still holding on to all their tanks, all their armed personnel carriers, and all that stuff. Like, they can, any minute, turn all that stuff right back on. And so it's very, very much like Occupied Palestine, and the people here know it.
So I want to read you something real quickly that I came across the other day. And this is from a report that was written about police violence. And it includes this. The nature of the response to the situation was unrestrained and indiscriminate police violence on many occasions, particularly at night. That violence was made all more shocking by the fact that it was often inflicted upon persons who had broken no law, disobeyed no order, made no threat. These included peaceful demonstrators, onlookers, and large numbers of residents who were simply passing through or happened to live in the areas where confrontations were occurring. Newsmen and photographers were singled out for assault and their equipment deliberately damaged. Fundamental police training was ignored, and officers, when on the scene, were often unable to control their troops. As one police officer put it, what happened didn't have anything to do with police work. The report concludes, if no action is taken, the effect can only be to discourage the majority of police officers responsibly and further weaken the bond between police and community. Although the crowds were finally dispelled, the problems they represent have not been. Surely this is not the last time that a violent dissenting group will clash head-on with those whose duty it is to enforce the law. And this is from the report, and the next time the whole world will still be watching. Pete, those words were written in 1968 after the violence at the Chicago Democratic National Convention. That was the Walker Report, which the governor commissioned to determine what had gone wrong. They determined that the Chicago police force had conducted what was described as a police riot. Did we see a police riot the other night in Ferguson, and should we be worried about another one?
I think we should definitely run another one. I think we definitely did. My feeling from people talking to people on the ground and stuff like that was that, it was pretty much a peaceful protest. People were really, really angry, but no one was trying to destroy property or anything like that until they were provoked by the police, is the number one thing that I've seen and heard. And I was talking to journalists that were on the ground then, local journalists and stuff like that, especially, who were here. And so, yes, and it's kind of like the quote, like, cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. Like, these guys really couldn't control their own people, and a lot of it too, I think, was the brass, was the sergeants and lieutenants and stuff like that, who were egging their own people on to be more brutal even. And that was kind of a scary thing. You might have seen the video where there was a sergeant in the local police force yelling, like, goading protesters, calling them effing animals and stuff like that. This has been very, very common, it seems like, when they respond to things like this. And for the most part, it was people that were, just like any other march you see in D.C. Like, I've been to a lot of these, like, over the years of my time living in Washington. Like, people do it all the time. D.C. police know how to handle it. Like, they don't show up in riot gear. They talk to people like people, and nothing bad really happens. But if you dress people up in riot gear and treat everything like a riot, and you're already seen as an occupying force because you're an all-white police force in a very, very, very prominently black city, like, it's gonna escalate the situation to the point that no one can really control it, and the police definitely are lost control of their own people and everything else.
All right. Well, we're gonna keep watching. Obviously, we want you to stay safe. So Credo Mobile, Credo, and We Act Radio and the Zero Hour have a live stream that you've been running. Where can people go to find that?
So they can actually find it at act.credo.org/go/Ferguson, or if you search on YouTube, the channel is Credo's Ferguson Justice Live, and we're going to post a lot of videos there that are not just the 4 and 5 hour long live streams we're doing. A lot of shorter videos you can share with people, and a lot of reactions from the crowd and stuff like that. And we're also putting up tons of photos and other media on social media and places like that.
All right. Well, Pete Callahan, stay safe out there. Thanks. And we'll conclude our report from Ferguson again by repeating those words from 1968. Although the crowds were finally dispelled on the nights of violence, the problems they represent have not been. Surely this is not the last time a violent dissenting group will clash head on with those whose duty it is to enforce the law. And the next time, the whole world will still be watching. The whole world still is watching, and so are we. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.